So something I've always done, is I keep track of all of my little mementos from school, elementary school, up through high school, into college, and beyond. And I put them in these little binders. And here's the binder I had for high school. If you look at it, it's chock full of stuff. Report cards, academic awards, track and field stuff, more track and, all these things you can earn through high school. But while I was doing all of this, there was one major program that had been put into place that was going to be more significant than any other honors awards you could get. It was literally going to be the program of the future, the kind of thing that was going to get you a bunch of letters from a bunch of colleges, because you were going to be so damn smart and so ready for the world. And I went into that program, and doggone it, I passed it. And what did I get for it? This little certificate.
The Certificate of Initial Mastery, or CIM. Back when I was in school, it was prepped to become the standard by which all high school kids in America would be judged on. I not only attended school in the first school district in the country that required passing CIM to graduate, but I was in the first graduating class required to pass it. When I was there, CIM was presented as though it was everything. So why is it then that only a couple years later, it was all but abandoned? I'm going to be roasting this program ceaselessly in this piece, but to get you all in the right headspace, let me just note the names of the two certificates one could get in this program. A Certificate of Initial Mastery, CIM. And then, if you were a genius, you could go on to achieve a Certificate of Advanced Mastery, or CAM as it was called. I mean, you can go onto Google and quickly type in, give me a definition for the word mastery. And when I did it, two possible definitions popped up. One says mastery is comprehensive knowledge or skill in a subject or accomplishment. So, how do you initially have comprehensive knowledge? And the second definition is control or superiority over someone or something. Well, if you have control over someone, I guess you could initially have control over something and then lose it, but the definition of mastery is not having superiority and then losing it. It doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, there's Certificate of Advanced Mastery. Well, if you've mastered something, you're already advanced. The whole term is redundant. And of course, none of this matters because nothing about this program was going to make you a master of anything. Lots of people pointed out this when I was in school. The educational, bureaucratic, verbal diarrhea was up front and center on this one. But in essence, the CIM CAM program was initially established as an outcome-based program that would ultimately hint in the direction of standardized testing. Boo. It originated from a 1990 report put out by the National Center for Education and Economy, a report produced to set new standards in education reform laws, standards, and assessments. In the report, a need was expressed to have a new standard for students to achieve by the age of 16. This standard would be achieved through a series of performance-based tasks, what would come to be known simply as CIM tasks. Upon passing this standard, the student would receive a certificate of completion which would help them go into the workforce, a college prep program, or to begin studies for a technical or a professional certificate. That was the real objective behind CIM and CAM, to further advance one's abilities to have success in the working world. Having a CIM certificate in your back pocket was certain to give one advanced opportunities in future employment. You may note here, not a lot of talk about following the traditional route of going to a college after high school, which was kind of odd. And furthermore, completing a CIM certificate at age 16, or specifically by the end of one's sophomore year of high school, allowed for students to complete a CAM certificate by the time they finished high school. Through these tasks, one could demonstrate their understanding of subject matter, problem solving, organization, working with others, and communicating ideas and information. Of course, among other things. While this new program was being pushed to become the new standard for the nation by the end of the 90s, it had particularly caught on in the Pacific Northwest, my little corner of the world. The state of Oregon, my home, had been reeling throughout the 80s in terms of public education. In 1991, the state legislature passed the Oregon Educational Act for the 21st Century, whose objective was to establish a world-class educational system for the state. Of course, they were only all too giddy to make passing CIM a part of that system. This was going to be a rigorous system with such high expectations that it was destined to fail. The objective with CIM was that the tasks would cover an assortment of different subjects, including science, language arts, history, geography, math, foreign arts, and others.
Pamela Lesh, City Club member. Could you spend a little bit more time talking about who will establish the requirements for the Certificate of Initial Mastery, how they might go about it, and then eventually who will be applying it?
The requirements to get to the Certificate of Initial Mastery will require for somebody or some organization, and it's interesting, we don't have that information at the national level, as I understand it, so we may have to start from scratch to review what the curricula are in nations all over the world and in our own USA, and to begin to develop that kind of a curriculum benchmark up to the year 2010 so that we can begin to achieve those high-level standards. That will be done initially gathering all that information and all that research in the Department of Education, and then we'll be going through some rigorous review by practitioners, by educators, by the community in adding or deleting or enriching the core curriculum and the essential learning skills.
And to help these students become better prepared in this new system, statewide tests were given to kids in the 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 11th grades with the objective to be used in predetermining the expectations of a given student. And the overall expectations under this new system were almost offensively strict. When the question of how this new system might affect special ed students, the reply was essentially, tough shit. We might adjust things slightly, but you're still expected to achieve at a high level, along with those that were without a disability. Amidst this new legislation, it became a new requirement for the state to produce yearly report cards showing the progress that they were having. An amendment to this act in 1995 only advanced these rigorous new standards. The plan became to extend school years extensively from 185 days in 1996 to 220 days by 2000. The state of Oregon even suggested that by the year 2000, interestingly enough, the year I began high school, that they'd have the best educated citizens in the nation.
Well, let's take a look at the Oregon's statewide assessments in reading and math for 1999, at the dawn of the new millennium. The bottom two rows represent the numbers for 8th and 10th graders, potentially the most important for those trying to pass CIM. Almost half of the 8th graders were not meeting the set standards, and almost half of 10th graders were not meeting reading standards, while almost 2/3 were not meeting standards in math. I can say, as a poor math student with a C- in geometry as a 10th grader, which would have been 2002, I met the standards for my assessment that year, so I feel I can safely say the standards were not too remarkably high. And yet still so many students were struggling. Now, it is worth noting that these numbers were affected by alternative schools and juvenile correction facilities, wherein often 60 to 100% of students were not meeting standards. But at the same time, these places made for a microscopic representation of the overall student body in Oregon. Simply put, and perhaps no big shocker, all of those hazy dreams the state had back at the start of the 90s were not quite coming to fruition.
As CIM tasks were being introduced to me in middle school, I had no idea how long in the works this program had been. It was just another thing we had to do. In another effort in promoting this new CIM standard, a 2000 publication was produced by Jobs for the Future, the Coalition of Essential Schools, and the U.S. Department of Education. It was titled Reinventing High School: 6 Journeys of Change. This piece took a look at 6 high schools in America and how they were transforming their educational programs. One of those was Rex Putnam High School in Milwaukie, Oregon, the school I began at in September of that year. It was then that I learned the dark truth of my future. The 2004 graduating class in the North Clackamas School District, my school district, was to be the first school district in the nation to require passing CIM in order to graduate. This was particularly harsh on me, as by the time I finished middle school, I hadn't passed a single CIM task yet. But whatever. Those tasks were really just preparation for the real thing in high school. Besides, I don't even have those middle school tasks anymore. However,
Alright, so let me just try to really clarify what CIM was like, because so far I've been throwing a lot of words, a lot of bureaucratic verbiage your way, but what CIM ultimately came down to, in terms of my experience, it was very simple. It came down to 2 things. Periodic state testing every couple of years, just to see where you're at, and a succession of different tasks you would have to do, which were just these kind of general assignments. Do the assignment, you'll be graded based on whatever subject it was. You'd be graded on a few different areas. And while I've lost probably about 90% of any documentation I've ever had through my life, particularly school assignments, one thing I still have in relatively good condition are all of my CIM tasks. Probably part of the reason why I chose to do this video was I knew I was going to have some evidence to go with it.
so as you can tell, Oregon, but more importantly my school district, were really throwing their eggs into one basket on this one. But with projected standards so high, it probably wouldn't surprise you to hear that lots of things went wrong, and a great deal of elements of this new program were never even implemented. Where do I even start? Well, hey, first off, remember those report cards I was telling you about earlier that the state needed to produce each year to show their progress? The year's report card for 2001, the end of my freshman year, and a point wherein Oregon said they were going to have the smartest people in the world, or some crap like that, only 26% of high school graduates had passed CIM. 2002 showed a slight increase to 31%, but the state was showing a decline in high school completion. This was not a great start. By 2003, the percentage of students graduating with a CIM certificate rose to 32%. And by 2004, the big year, the state showed dropping scores in the fields of reading, writing, and math. These were the very things that CIM was supposed to fix. And while graduation levels had gone up by this point, the percentage of those graduating was still lower than it had been 10 years earlier. And 2004 was also the first year since 1998 that the number of high school dropouts actually increased. And finally, only 33% of all high schoolers had passed CIM, even with my school district supposedly giving the state a big boost. The writing was clearly on the wall when, after those passing CIM in 2005 increased to almost 37% in the state, it plummeted back down to 31% in 2006. The graduation rate was also in steady decline over this time, and in fact, those numbers didn't turn around until the 2007-2008 school year. A new state bill just happened to pass at this same time, removing CIM as a state requirement. Next, there were 10 guiding principles initially established to explain what was expected of students under this educational program, much of it being extremely vague in nature. 1 was to use broad educational goals, whatever that means. 2 noted that students were expected to meet high academic and performance standards, again, acting kind of tone deaf in terms of struggling students and ones with disabilities. 3 stated all students would be required to demonstrate knowledge in state tests and performance-based assessments, which pretty much just meant you had to pass CIM. 4, it would incorporate work-based, community-based learning experiences, something I got more out of a sophomore year job shadow than I did in all of my CIM tasks and state tests put together. 5 asked for an increased integration of professional, technical, and academic instruction. Unless you were going to the Sabin Skills Center in my district, which had specialized classes, you weren't getting much of this instruction otherwise. 6 asked to integrate career awareness, exploration, and planning, which I mostly achieved in a class that I took sophomore year that was called Future Focus, a class where, interestingly enough, I took 0 CIM tasks. 7 asked to implement a project-based approach to teaching and learning. I guess we did projects in high school, didn't we all? 8 asked to encourage thematic, integrated instruction across subject areas at all grade levels, which pretty much just meant teach multiple subjects when you're teaching subjects, or I don't know. And 9 asked to establish a broad, career-related interdisciplinary programs of study for underclassmen that provide focus to their academic work. Again, you pretty much had to go to Sabin for that. And finally, 10 give students structured pathways from high school to higher education and advanced occupational training through coordinated programs of study. CIM was definitely expected to play a critical role in that. But you see, just a lot of blah 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 and mumbo jumbo without much direction. Just a blank canvas with some expectation that by the end of the 90s, a beautiful work of art would grace it. But that's obviously not what happened. There was also a great emphasis, again, on working in groups and performing well with peers, which is good and fine, but CIM tasks were just individual tasks, one completed on their own. There was also great emphasis that CIM tasks would help students in the realm of getting better with technology and mathematics. And while there were math CIM tasks, honestly, one of the greatest failures of CIM was its total lack of technological significance. Expectations were obnoxiously high at the start, which was easy to do since no work had actually been done yet. But the presumption that students would have their CIM done by the age of 16 and their CAM done by 18 was drastically flawed. I was a bit of a late bloomer, but still managed to pass my CIM by the end of my junior year. I don't remember a single fellow student passing CAM. I'm sure there were a couple, but they were probably the borderline valedictorian kids who were already destined for success, with or without CIM and CAM at their side. The fact of the matter is that CIM was expected to change the world and open up endless doors to students, but they were really just a series of general assignments, graded in a certain way. I honestly don't know what some school districts, or Oregon, or America, for that example, really saw in it. I graduated in 2004, got my dinky little CIM certificate, and by 2005, everyone was turning on it. In that year, the state determined they could save some $38 million if they just scrapped the whole thing. State Representative Jerry Crummell held nothing back when he said of the program, "Let's kill it. Let's get rid of it. It's a 14-year experiment that has not worked." Despite this, my school district still stuck to its guns for a bit longer. But they could only hold on so long, with the rest of the state jumping ship and the further advancements of No Child Left Behind legislation. With criticism peaking and the ending near in 2005, the Oregon State Superintendent, Susan Castillo, complimented the hard work kids had done on CIM in the years past, but criticized it, saying, "As it stands now, the CIM is not meaningful to all students." I tend to take that comment and tweak it slightly to say it was not meaningful to any students. Here's the big issue that the school districts didn't want students to know at the time. Colleges did not care about CIM. No Oregon-based college that I applied to in 2004 asked about CIM. Makes you wonder why it was so focused on getting one out into the workforce after high school. It was just early state testing. Nonsense under the guise of a new program that would catapult children into the future, as far as I'm concerned. Just enough to get you a crappy, maybe just above minimum wage job with very few opportunities for advancement. Like George Carlin said, although I'm paraphrasing, "Our country wants obedient workers, people just smart enough to work the machinery but not smart enough to have critical thinking and to passively accept a crappy future for themselves." I feel that's CIM in a nutshell. And not only did colleges not care about CIM, but the students didn't care about it either. CIM was a nuisance. We laughed at it. None of us thought it would actually help our futures, and yet the heads of education were blissfully oblivious. From my own experience, what are further reasons as to why CIM was unsuccessful are, well, first off, they were subject to the biases of the teachers grading the tasks. I failed some tasks that I felt I did better on than those I passed, but I just had a more strict teacher at the time. To counter this, an easy teacher could pass a student even if they didn't perform on the task all that well. There was no consistency. And also, like students, I never got the feeling that any of my teachers cared for the CIM program either. And so a good example of this in terms of your scores being very dependent on what type of teacher you had, one of my favorite teachers, this is sophomore year, I did a piece about the Constitutional Convention, something I don't really remember much about at all. And I got 90 out of 100 as a general assignment, but it was also a CIM task. And I got all 5s and a 4, but I got a 2 for citations because this was during that period of my life where I forgot works cited pages. So at the last second, I had to write out my cited pages by hand. So I got graded down because I didn't type it. It wasn't included with the original thing. But then he scratched it out, and I actually don't even have a score for citations, but it says, you can fix this. But then that's scratched out, and he just kind of changed it. Like, it says I don't meet and I do meet. Now, a lot of teachers wouldn't have done that for you, but this was one of my favorite teachers. He was a really cool guy, and he knew the assignment was really good, and I shouldn't get screwed by this BS CIM system because of one little accident I made. That in the real world, having to produce documents, paperwork, whatever, is something that could be fixed in 5 minutes. So, yeah. Students were also required to achieve a score of 4 or higher in each category they were graded on a given task, which meant if a student did remarkably well on a task and achieved a perfect score of a 6 in all categories, except for one where they, let's say, got a 3 on, they wouldn't pass. I equate this to taking 4 tests and achieving a perfect score before scoring a 59 on the 5th test. A combination of those scores would still average out to a 92 or an A. But in the equivalency of a CIM task, you would fail. Now, the opposite of this can also be the case, where you didn't do well in a bunch of categories, but could still meet a standard in relation to CIM. And that is through the general testing you would do. I actually have documentation from a few different years. And I was never a great science student, and these are specifically science tests I'm holding up. But case in point, this here is my 2000 Oregon statewide assessment that I took in 8th grade. This was my 8th grade science test to see how well I was keeping up with the expectations. So if you hit in this little area right here, that meant you met the standard. And as you can see up here, my total test score, I got a 236, and a 232 to 234 was passing. So when I took this test, as far as CIM was concerned, I was passing, nothing to worry about, move along. But you'll also see I was graded in 5 different categories: unifying concepts and processes, physical science, life science, earth science, scientific inquiry. And you'll note in all the categories except life science, because apparently I was a life science prodigy at some point in my life and didn't know it, I did not meet the standard. So as far as CIM statewide testing is concerned, I passed. Nothing to worry about. And yet I did not meet their standard in 4 out of 5 categories. Just doesn't seem like a great system. So actually reading literature is not that full. But yeah, if I look, yeah, here we go. I got all 4s. And I had to be graded by a teacher's assistant on that who was trying really hard to fit in. So I think that's probably part of the reason. This is probably the first reading CIM task
that I actually passed. Yeah, my grade 10 reading state testing thing, and it's real. I passed. I had to get at least a 240, and I got a 243, but I was very back and forth because I actually struggled with reading comprehension in high school. My SAT score was 1030. Here we go, writing. I grew up, even though I struggled with reading comprehension, I was a really good writer. Yeah, this piece here, you will see, I got 6665, almost perfect score, and I exceeded. You know why? Because this was my freshman year. This was a writing assignment. We had to write at least a 5-page story. And I wrote an 80-page story. This is only half of it. The teacher didn't even read the first half of the story because it was so long. Look, it even says like student has the other half. This is just half the story. So I think that's probably the primary reason why I almost got perfect scores. But oh yeah, so this is my 10th grade. The state test for writing was apparently you wrote something that's like 4 paragraphs long, because that's very indicative of how good of a writer you are. Like this was the whole 10th grade writing test, was wide ruled paper, a brief story. And 2 people would read it and grade you based on it seems similar to the CIM scores. You got a 1 through 6. You probably had to get at least all 4s to pass. And I did get at least 4s and 5s, so I passed it. This just seems kind of, it's like, okay, you're in 10th grade and you've written a sentence or 2, so, it's all right. My worst enemy, mathematics. And you were graded on 4 areas, it appears: conceptual understanding, processes and strategies, verification and confusion, communication. Oh wait, also accuracy. That's the 5th category. It's down, it's hidden at the bottom, like they don't want you to know about it. The one that always bothered me the most, out of all the categories that you could get graded on any CIM task in any category, was the verification section on math CIM tasks. And the whole concept of that was you were given this math problem, you solved it however you did, and verification was you had to resolve the problem by using a completely different method. And the reason I hated this was because if you were really good at math or your brain worked on a whole other level, it was real easy to solve something and then go over here and resolve it using this method. I struggled a lot with that. There was a lot of, some of it was not being taught very well by the public schools. They would teach you one way to solve something, and then they would give you a CIM task and expect you to find a new way to solve it. So, if your brain worked well enough for you, you could figure out a new way, be like, oh, I guess I can do that. But a lot of us weren't being taught multiple ways to solve problems, at least not when I was in high school. And a lot of times I would get graded down on verification because I would kind of fudge. I would kind of pretty much solve it the same way I did the first time, just kind of alter it a bit, and teachers would usually catch that. Here's a CIM task from 10th grade, geometry. Pass, got 4s in all sections, 5 in accuracy. I got a 5, I got a perfect score for accuracy. That means I solved the problem. But I got a 2 on verification because I probably couldn't find a great way to resolve it. So I proved that I could solve this problem perfectly, but because I didn't have a backup method that I didn't need because I knew how to solve it right the first time, I failed this CIM task. I'm sorry, that's bullshit. Well, this one, see, I got a 1 for accuracy. That just means I got the answer wrong. So, if you didn't really know how to solve a problem and you got an answer that you hoped was right, when you did verification and tried to do it another way and it didn't come out right, you had to just kind of fake the math to make it match with your original answer, because the whole point of verification was to get the same answer you got in the first place. Here's something I really don't get. This is like one of the only sim tasks I didn't pass in 11th grade. I got it's because I got a 3 but I got the answer wrong. But I don't get how I got 5. What? I got a 1 for accuracy. That means I got the answer wrong. But for verification, I got a 5. But I still would have got, so I did a really good job. I guess what happened was I did a really good job at getting the same wrong answer. So at least my teacher knew my verification was going in the same way my original course of thinking was, which was still wrong. God, CIM is a joke.
And in the spirit of keeping up with all of these criticisms, let me just further elaborate. Under the subject of if you did fail, regardless what category or categories that failure occurred with, there was no real incentive to help students improve in those areas. Nobody said, oh, specifically verification and math, Steve, come to me and I'll help you get better at that. I remember every so often a teacher would throw that old, oh, come and see me for extra time, during my office hours. But how often do high schoolers ever take advantage of that? I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying, let's be real. And another frustrating thing that made things really difficult was you had to pass several sim tasks in each subject. And you really had limited opportunities to do that. This, once again, made passing these tasks in time to graduate considerably more difficult for some students.
I was scared out of my mind because you couldn't graduate if you didn't pass CIM. And even by the end of my freshman year, I had a lot of ground to cover, and that was incredibly stressful. So by the end of my freshman year, and I was struggling through depression over that summer. I did not love having this stuff held over my head and being genuinely scared. I could become a 4.0 student and maybe not graduate. It's not cool. I knew plenty of people that were perfectly well educated, at least B students. They passed their senior project, they passed all their classes, perfectly prepared to go on to college, who actually got briefly held back from graduating because they hadn't finished their CIM. They'd come up like 1 or 2 short on this stupid thing. And what's really sad is, because I went to school with some of these people, I remember who specifically this happened to. And essentially they had to kind of do a brief summer school thing where they do a few more of these and they'd kind of say, okay, fine, you pass, we'll let you graduate. Because everybody knew it was stupid for this one little thing to be the deciding factor on whether you could graduate or not. But what was so sad about this was you had to do more of these tasks and kind of be held back essentially from graduating. So these students couldn't even go to the high school graduation. So when we had this big elaborate, my graduating class, we were at the Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall, one of the most prominent venues in the city of Portland, like major musical acts performed there and stuff like that. So it was this big deal. And some of these students couldn't even go to their damn high school graduation, even though they were ultimately allowed to graduate because of this shit.
And I also recall sim tasks to be fairly redundant. I always felt like I was doing some semblance of the same assignment over and over and over again. And how does that fill a student with a sense that their horizons are being further broadened? I could go on, but I think I've made my point. CIM meant about as much to me as that little 10-point extra credit assignment your teacher would toss your way from time to time. And yet there was so much backing to it. Beyond the educational system, with lots of misinformation and more pie-in-the-sky sentiment in the late 90s heading into the 2000s about this program. I mean, it's truly mind-boggling how delusional people got about this system. And beyond my personal criticisms of CIM, there have been many others. In 2003, the Oregon State Legislature introduced House Bill 2415, which proposed the removal of the program and, alas, was never implemented. But in the legislature's documentation, it was noted that testimony was given by those who supported the bill, providing several reasons why they supported it. Some of these align with my personal criticisms, but I'm still going to include them as they represent the perspective of a section of the general public and not just me specifically. And that said, here are the reasons they gave for getting rid of the CIM program. Students, teachers, administrators do not support the CIM. It's the way it's written. I can mostly agree with that. Colleges are not interested in CIM or CAM. Accountability will be maintained through the federal No Child Left Behind Act. There is no need to go beyond the federal requirements. National standardized tests could be used rather than spend money creating unique tests for Oregon, preventing the comparison of Oregon students and students in other states. The system is costly and time-consuming, and the public has no faith that the tests accurately measure students' achievement and progress. That last one is actually pretty important. And in addition to that, they include the supporters of keeping CIM in place, and tragically, a lot of the arguments seem to be about money and control. One of their arguments was even delusional enough to say that the completion of CIM is valuable as it has been shown to be a strong predictor of college performance. That is an outright lie.
Now, I just have to add this. It's not directly related to CIM, but it's very closely connected to the attitudes of that time. It's kind of an addendum to the whole thing, because while CIM was coming along and becoming this major high school requirement for my graduating class, there was another thing that they had come up with kind of around the same time. And, most schools, the seniors will have some project of some kind. Well, my neck of the woods, like everything else, had to take that concept of a senior project and blow it up into something so much bigger that was so easy to manipulate that I think most of the kids that did it pretty much put little work into it and managed to pass. They called our project the whole name was the Senior Seminar Experience. It was going to be a life experience. It really wasn't. It wasn't for me, and it wasn't for anybody else I talked to about this project. And in essence, the Senior Seminar Experience was, we had a class period where pretty much the first week they would, break down exactly what the project was about. And then all those further class periods during that time were supposed to be used by students to do work on their project. They had till April to get it done. Of course, most people just treated it like a free period, and they would just go off and do whatever. Nobody was doing any actual work during that free period. And the concept was fairly simple. You needed to come up with a project of some kind. That was either a physically, you could hold it in your hands kind of thing. Like me, I wrote a book. We'll get more to that later. So it was a physical product you could hold in your hands. But it could be a concept or something you created. Like my best friend, who was really into track at the time, came up with this kind of exercise program, which he admitted to me later he pretty much stole out of a book. And one of the people who was his evaluator was one of the teachers we had, and he had the book that my friend stole most of his product out of, and he had no idea. But again, that gets to the point of how easy it was to fudge this thing. A lot of people sat on it and didn't do anything till the very end, myself included. And you had to have what was called, as I remember it, an advisor. Now, this was somebody who was versed in whatever area you were going into. And the book that I wanted to write was about just major issues in our society. And again, I'll get to that. So I had my dad's friend Ed be my advisor. This was a guy that had just he went to Willamette University, he'd been involved in the military. My dad told me he was like a lobbyist. Like this guy he'd done a lot of stuff. And the concept was, you got this advisor to help you through your project. They were supposed to give you all of this great information that was going to be so useful on your project. I remember talking to Ed twice The first time was when I was first starting, didn't even know what my book was about, and it was a lot of him just being like, well, you need to do this, and you need to do that, and me really not taking any of his advice, because I was like, screw you, I'm going to make this how I want to make it. The way that they tracked that you actually had an advisor and were speaking to them regularly was there was this form they had to sign that said like, oh yeah, I'm helping them with their project, and then sign it. And that was the one other time I saw Ed, was to say, hey, I need you to sign this. He was like, well, what the hell is this? Why do I have to sign this? I'm like, it's just something for the project. It just shows that you're helping me. And he was like, all right. And that was it. I pretty much got no help from him, barely talked to him at all. And I realized later on, you could literally, they didn't ask to meet these individuals. You pretty much just had to have them sign a couple of papers that said, yeah, I'm helping them with this project. And they had no idea who this person was. I could have literally forged a signature and they probably would have had no idea. This wasn't the FBI, this was my high school. You could literally lie and say you had this random advisor and just skip that whole part by just signing a piece of paper and giving it to them. And they'd be like, well, that's a signature. I had probably about 7 months to do this project. I did some research online first couple of weeks, and then I didn't do anything on the project. Did nothing until the last 3 or 4 days before the project was due in April. I sat down at the computer in this little corner office room we had at home, and I just had what little research I did. A lot of the subjects I covered, I didn't even get research. I just wrote what made sense to me. My project, my book that I wrote, was very much based on my personal perspectives of things. And I was a very conservative-minded young adult at this time. And I don't know what happened to the book. When I moved away from where I was living in 2017, I'm pretty sure I left it behind there. And I wish I could find it because I still remember some of the things I wrote in that book. And they're not great. For instance, I wrote multiple chapters about school shootings, which is actually something very kind of near and dear to me. I wrote a chapter about illegal immigration that I'm certain was riddled with racial stereotypes. And I wrote a chapter about homelessness, targeting Portland's homeless issue, which is of course now completely out of control. I wrote a piece about the homeless issue, and it came very much from that perspective of, you know, we need to keep babying these homeless people and they need to suck it up and go out and get a job and quit being lazy. Because I was an 18-year-old, very uninformed suburban kid who didn't realize that a lot of homeless people were, you know, teens who had been kicked out or run away from home, that a lot of homeless people had psychological issues, that a lot of them had drug addiction or, you know, any addiction, that it went a lot further than people being lazy. But of course, the way I used to think about the world and the way a lot of people that think the way I used to think, that's kind of their attitude, is people just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which is a very lazy way of thinking about it. I'm sitting here and I'm writing about these major issues, and I'm writing it from the perspective of somebody that didn't really know anything about any of them. It's kind of, that can be the toxicity of following common sense. People always say follow common sense, but your own common sense is usually going to be tainted by your own biases and beliefs. People were always telling me how smart I was because I was book smart. So I thought, you know, I'm smart, and if I use my common sense, I'll have the accurate perspective on anything, even if I had no background on it, even if I hadn't so much as read a newspaper article about it. So I'm out here writing about things that I know nothing about, thinking I know everything about them because I'm so damn smart. And in the end, I had this book that I spent very little time working on that had very troubling perspectives on a lot of issues. I didn't have time to spell check it. It had to have been riddled with grammatical and spelling errors. I didn't even cite my sources properly. I just wrote the book and then did a bibliography at the end. It was a horribly rushed project, but I went up, you know, at the time I was proud of these perspectives that I had, and I came up and I did this surprisingly good 20-minute presentation. I had my note cards. I barely felt I needed them. I spoke with a strong voice, and, you know, here we are. It's about 20 minutes. I have 3 different people analyzing my performance. That was how the final thing was. And they need to pay most of their attention to me. They need to pay attention to my presentation. How am I doing it? Am I making eye contact? Am I making sense? Is what I'm saying going with the project? So they didn't have a lot of time. I saw them. Each person kind of like opened it, and, you know, it was like 100 pages. And they just kind of were like, oh. And that was it. That was literally all they did. They didn't have time to actually read it. So they just assume that when I said, oh, I care so much about these subjects and I put my emotion into it, and that I did all this great research that I never did, and I was coming from this great humanist perspective on things when I really wasn't. I was coming from a spoiled suburban kid's perspective on things where I hadn't really had to deal with anything super serious in my life. I'd always had a roof over my head. I'd always been able to eat, sometimes not a lot, but... And I still have all of the evaluation sheets that these 3 evaluators did. And all 3 of them gave me a perfect score on that project. I exceeded expectations on this project, which I was so proud of at the time. And now I look back years later and I'm like, okay, I mean, I still did work, I guess. And I just think I made this piece of trash that I didn't work very hard on, that doesn't remotely represent the perspectives I hold today or the perspectives of any decent person. But because of the way that this senior seminar experience was put together, as far as anybody was concerned, I had achieved absolute perfection. Which, like CIM, sounds like the biggest load of horseshit I could imagine.
And as for CIM, I mean, it just kind of fizzled out. There was no major event that pushed it away, no grand announcement like we are severing ties with the demonic program, and we apologize profusely to those who were trapped in its wake. Nothing like that. It just seems like wherever you lived, somewhere between 2006 and 2008, you finally said the hell with CIM. Even the National Center on Education and Economy, which was instrumental in the establishment of CIM, had abandoned even referencing it by 2006. Many elements that were supposed to be bore out by CIM, such as passing certain requirements by the age of 16 and an emphasis on outcome-based education, have, understandably, remained in future programs. And, once again, No Child Left Behind legislation also served as an inevitable death knell to the CIM-CAM program. In my humble state of Oregon, where, again, CIM was like crack to some educators, the CIM program was finally all but eliminated in 2007 to be replaced with the Oregon Diploma program. I don't know how successful that program has been, but being a major redesign effort via the state educational system, it's probably been a mixed bag. And that was it. CIM has been gone now for over 15 years. And logically, practically anyone under the age of 30 has probably never heard of it. It was a program massive in thought, but weak, compromising, and practically useless in its execution. Nobody getting a job out of high school or going into a technical program was flashing their CIM certificate around. When I started community college in the fall of 2004, nobody cared about CIM. We were just happy that that hellhole of a program was behind us. And even when I transferred to the University of Portland a few years later, CIM was all but gone, and they didn't care either. I wrote a book on the JFK assassination in my free time and submitted passages from that with my college application, and that got me much farther in terms of being accepted at Portland than a CIM certificate ever would. Today, that particular certificate of mine still sits where it belongs, in the last sleeve of a binder containing all of my high school's accomplishments. Sometimes I forget I even got it, seeing as they didn't even mail it to me till almost a year after I graduated high school. It just sits back there, collecting dust, much like the history of the program itself. Thank God you were short-lived, CIM. You were the kid nobody invited to the party. You were the new video game nobody asked for. You were the Titanic, gone as quickly as you got here. You won't be missed. You stupid asshole.